With the release of The Rise of Skywalker finishing off the sequel trilogy, it's become pretty popular to compare or speculate about what George Lucas's potential plans were for his own sequel trilogy before the Disney buyout, especially with the talks of the unused treatments he wrote before J.J. Abrams went another direction with The Force Awakens. Rather than focus on those plans specifically, today I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of George Lucas's older original speculations about what the Star Wars franchise may have ended up looking like, primarily using older interviews from around the time of the original trilogy's release. It's pretty obvious, especially in retrospect, that most of these ideas were just musings rather than solid plans, especially before the first movie's release. It'd be impossible to know the multi-generational phenomenon that Star Wars would turn into, but it's still interesting to get that take from George in its earliest forms. The earliest especially relevant interview I can find is a recently republished one by the LA Times from June 5th, 1977, where George, funnily enough, calls Star Wars the kind of movie that Walt Disney would make if he were alive today. With his new space opera, he was aiming to make a movie that was, quote, science fiction without the science. I wanted an engaging Saturday matinee movie, but not camp or parody, and not a heavily intellectual trip like 2001. Think of this as The Sting in outer space. With respect to ideas for a broader franchise, George essentially lays out his plans as having 3 or 4 movies where he'd essentially be a creative force behind them, but Star Wars, which we'll just call A New Hope for simplicity, would be the only one where he was the director. It's worth noting that in the lead up to Empire Strikes Back, the idea of what 6 Star Wars movies might look like was actually very different. There's original overview draft in The Making of Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, which showed notes from around that time period of New Hope as Episode 6, with another movie before it and a Clone Wars trilogy before that, then Episode 1 being before that Clone Wars trilogy. Structurally, if it helps to think of it this way, you could picture Episode 1 as essentially being what Episode 1 ended up being, then you'd have Attack of the Clones, the Clone Wars animated movie, and Revenge of the Sith as the Clone Wars trilogy after that, then something like maybe Rogue One being the new Episode 5, then Episode 6 being A New Hope, and after that we got Episode 7 and subsequent movies being about Luke bringing down the Empire and the Emperor, restoring the Jedi and the New Republic. These plans extended over 5 further movies after A New Hope, so the original trilogy that we got, and then another sequel trilogy after that, for a grand total of 12 films. This seems to be the earliest indication of what may have been a sequel trilogy, but George's ideas evolved from there over production of the next 2 movies. It also mentions a lost sister, which at the time likely wasn't intended to be Leia, but did factor very heavily into what he was planning. Well, George wrote a short initial treatment for Empire Strikes Back, which was then rewritten by Leigh Brackett and rewritten once again by Lucas, this time with the new twist of Darth Vader as Luke's father, with those elements remaining in place for the final screenplay by Lawrence Kasdan, who went on to write Return of the Jedi with Lucas as well. The job of directing the film also went to Irvin Kershner, who helped Kasdan on the final script drafts. This structure essentially fits with what George had been talking about in the LA Times interview, where he would be the creative force behind Star Wars, but other people would essentially execute on his vision. This is also the first time that George seemed to decide more solidly that the movies should end up being 2 trilogies, with Empire Strikes Back being Episode 5 instead of Episode 7 like that original draft may have shown. Kershner had also been asked to continue on and direct Return of the Jedi, which is a bit of a digression from George's plan to have different people direct each one, though according to a Vanity Fair interview, he turned it down because of how long he had just spent on Empire Strikes Back. Kershner did add that had George started to make the prequels in the 80s and 90s like he'd originally planned instead of a decade later, he would have wanted to direct a prequel as well. As Empire was developed, there was an on-set interview where George confirmed the idea of doing 2 main trilogies, basically the trilogies we're familiar with from him, and added that after the success of A New Hope, again at this time just called Star Wars, he was working on plans for a sequel trilogy as well. The overall plot would be about holding the galaxy together after the fall of the Empire, and he described them as being much more ethereal. Again, his plans for specifics with any of these points likely fluctuated wildly. The descriptions we got of his ideas for the sequels with the buyout likely vary from any ideas he had back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. I've done a previous video on how the ideas behind the Clone Wars evolved in the time between the original and prequel trilogies, with the expanded universe, and well, that's not obviously directly linked to George, it was somewhat based on the impressions he and his work gave. Even just looking at how some ideas evolved over the original trilogy, there's every indication that while he may have a broader narrative set out, a lot of the details would vary from time to time. What does seem to be fairly consistent though, is the hint of it being much more ethereal, That somewhat ties into what we learned about with his pre-Disney plans, so it's possible some major themes remain the same at least. Towards the end of Return of the Jedi, George described feeling some Star Wars fatigue, and he was burning out on the franchise. He said at that point that any future trilogy would be someone else's vision. This ended up not being the case obviously, with George coming back to develop the prequels and direct them himself, although seemingly a bit later than he'd intended, as the Kirshner interview alluded to. It's hard to say what exactly the sequels would have looked like under George in their final form, but I hope you've enjoyed this look at the evolution of his ideas of the franchise in its early days. I intend to do a similar video about the development of the Star Wars transmedia and expanded universe pretty soon. If you have any other suggestions for topics you'd like to see, please leave them in the comments, and if you have any questions, leave them with the hashtag QuestionTime. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing for more. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.